Good morning. Today we will be studying the chapter on infectious diseases in our course of A-level biology. There are only 5 to 6 infectious diseases which are included in the syllabus. They include TB, cholera, measles, and HIV/AIDS. So first, we will be starting off with what are infectious diseases. Infectious diseases are the basically diseases which are spread by organisms which are known as pathogens. Now, these are communicable diseases which can be passed from the people who are infected from disease to those who are not infected from it. So, what is the distinguishing main factor between infectious and non-infectious diseases? Is that infectious diseases mainly are acute in nature. They stay for a short time in comparison to non-infectious diseases, and mostly the deaths which occur during a short span of time are due to infectious diseases such as dengue or malaria, rather than non-infectious diseases which happen over a period of years, such as cancer or lung cancer or COPD, for example. So, first we have to remember that there are several modes of transfer of infectious diseases. These include viruses, bacteria, and fungi. However, the organism which basically transmits the disease is known as the vector, and the organism which produces the disease is known as the causative organism. So now we will be starting off the chapter with the basic terminologies which are important. So what is an epidemic? An epidemic is a disease which is basically localized in a certain group of people, and however, when, for example, coronavirus was initially classified as an epidemic, and WHO characterized it as a pandemic when it spread globally across more than 100 countries and eventually all across the globe. Now, the death rate from the disease is referred to as a mortality. And what do we mean by prevalence? The prevalence of a disease is the number of people who are affected by the disease at any given point of time. Now, the first disease we'll be studying is cholera. So basically the bacteria Vibrio cholera has is motile. It has a tail which you can see over here. So it can easily move in the body. Its primary action is in the small intestine. However, in order to cross into the small intestine, it has to pass through the stomach. Now the stomach, as we all know, is acidic, and it does not basically have the conditions which are suitable for cholera to survive. Thus, cholera basically secretes several exotoxins which help to survive, and as well as people who take a lot of PPIs, they have a lesser acidic environment. So, what are the clinical presentations of cholera? The main clinical presentation of cholera is watery diarrhea. There is excessive diarrhea, and which is basically accompanied by thirst and severe dehydration and cramps, as well as fatigability, since the body is immensely depleted of water. Now, how is cholera transmitted? Transmitted cholera is mainly transmitted fecally as it is present in contaminated water. Now, which I studied just told you that the cholera removed secreted toxin. This toxin is known as choleragen. So this basically disrupts the function of the epithelium and disrupts the muscularis mucosa. For the treatment of cholera, the main aim of ours is to basically restore the hydration by using oral rehydrate salt or ORS, commonly known, so that the body can be replenished with all the mineral salts and water it has lost. Now, the cholera is mostly prevalent in developing countries due to unsanitary conditions. Now, the next basically disease we'll be covering is malaria. So malaria is mainly prevalent in African countries because of the climate, as it favors the breeding of Anopheles mosquito. Now this is the vector which transmits this disease, and what is the organism which produces it? The causative organism is Plasmodium malariae. So Plasmodium basically produces the disease. This is a parasite which grows into the mosquito, and once the mosquito basically infects a human by biting it or taking his blood, the organisms, the mosquito helps to spread the disease. Now, the important thing to take away from this is that we have to remember that a person only suffers from malaria when a mosquito bites twice into him. Because first he needs to develop eggs, and the male and female gametes have to basically fuse and fertilize within the mosquito. And on the second meal, when another mosquito of the same basically species Anopheles bites, then the parasite release is released within the bloodstream of the person. So we have to remember this. Now, what are the clinical presentations? The main clinical presentation is that malaria presents with fever as well as anemia, which means there is a low hemoglobin. Of course, there is a nausea and vomiting. Now, the distinguishing factor between the fever in malaria is that this fever is associated with chills and night sweating. Since the parasite also travels to the liver and the spleen, Plasmodium malaria is also associated with bloody diarrhea. Now, there are several types of species of Plasmodium: Plasmodium falciparum, Plasmodium vivax, and Plasmodium ovale. The most important category is Plasmodium falciparum. And what is its distinguishing factor? How we can basically distinguish it is that Plasmodium falciparum has a signature appearance when it affects the red blood cells. So how do we basically prevent malaria? The easy way is to basically just get rid of all the water, open water sources, or drain them out. Similarly, use nets and use mosquito repellents. For people, since malaria is primarily endemic in the African countries. So as per saying, the various drugs for treating malaria include chloroquine. Now, how does chloroquine work? Chloroquine basically Plasmodium malaria feeds on the blood of a normal human person. It basically ingests hemoglobin in the form of heme. This heme is converted into hemozoin as it is the Plasmodium malaria is basically toxic to heme. However, what chloroquine does is it inhibits protein synthesis and it inhibits the conversion of heme to hemozoin, thus basically killing the plasmodium. Apart from that, multiple drugs have been used, such as artemisinin, doxycycline. Now, the problem is that due to overusage of these drugs, there have been mutations in the plasmodium, and they have basically become drug resistant. So combinations of different drugs are used, such as mefloquine and artemisinin. However, though these have side effects such as nausea and vomiting, but these are the most used drugs. Now, apart from this, the other type of disease which we will be studying is AIDS now and HIV. So AIDS is basically called HIV. Now, why is AIDS? There has been no vaccine developed against AIDS is because you see these glycoprotein 120 and G glycoprotein 41. The problem is that AIDS has been mutating. It's mutates so rapidly that people are unable to basically capture a single type of genome of it and make its copy so that they can make a vaccine for a similar strain of DNA. There are so many strains that it is nearly impossible to make a vaccine for a single one of them. The other distinguishing factor of AIDS is that it is a virus which is an RNA virus, and it is a single stranded in nature, which is just different from the double-stranded viruses. Now, the most important methods of transfer are firstly blood by contaminated syringes, which have been used again and again. Secondly, by unprotected sexual intercourse, and thirdly, by the placenta from mother to the baby. It basically is transferred through the fluids. So now, what is AIDS? HIV develops into AIDS, and it is basically an opportunistic infection. What is that does is that it attacks the CD4 T helper lymphocytes in the body, and then basically decreases the overall immunity of the body, so that the propensity for other infections such as Candida albicans, which is an oral thrush or a fungus, which basically mainly infects people like who have decreased immunity of old age and diabetics. It infects people of all ages. So it's apart from that, in the other opportunistic infection, It causes escaposis sarcoma. Now, this is an extremely important infection. So now, in what populations is it more is categorized in? It is more characterized in people who have unprotected sexual intercourse and in homosexual males, because during anal intercourse, the epithelium lining of the anus of the rectum is more thinner than the vagina, and this basically fluids secreted from, for example, semen can easily reach the bloodstream, and thus the other person can become infected. Now, the average lifespan of people who are suffering from AIDS significantly decreased, and now when is a- HIV characterized as AIDS? It is when the T helper lymphocyte count decreases below 200. This is all the information I just talked to you about HIV and AIDS. Now, how to prevent HIV and AIDS? Firstly, we should use condoms. Secondly, there should be use of sterilized substances, and the needles and syringes once used, they should not be used again, and they should be thrown away. There should not be any recycling of them. Now, the other infectious disease we'll be covering is the bacteria tuberculosis. Now, Mycobacterium tuberculosis is mainly predominant in the developing countries and the poorer nations, because it also spreads in those conditions where there is overcrowding of people living in a single house. It mainly is transmitted by respiration, by respiratory droplets, as the person has extreme cough and is or has chest pain. Now the person has fever along with night sweats. So how do we diagnose it? We diagnose it microscopically by examining the sputum. The sputum is the basically the saliva which is released during cough. And we also do a chest X-ray. Now, the Mycobacterium tuberculosis, how it spreads in the body is by making a granuloma. It hides within the body and basically infects all the macrophages inside the body. How Now there are two types of TB. One is acute TB, in which all the symptoms are present. However, in several people of old age, there is hidden or latent TB, in which the TB has been in an inactive state for several years and suddenly it becomes reactivated in old age. So the people can suddenly become basically susceptible to TB after a secondary infection, for example, in HIV affected people. Now, apart from as I told you that it travels from respiratory droplets, another form of TB spreads from milk, especially that milk that is and that hasn't been pasteurized. And the type of bacteria which spreads that type of illness is called Mycobacterium bovis. So now, how do we treat the TB? Obviously, since it is a bacterial disease, the only option is to basically treat it via antibiotics. Now, there are several antibiotics. However, there has have been development of drug-resistant TB due to the overusage of antibiotics. There is a combination of antibiotics used of over about 6 months, which include rifampin, isoniazid, and pyrazinamide. So, after we've talking about TB, the last condition we'll be talking about is measles. Measles mainly develops in children, and it is an extremely infectious disease. It is the most infectious, comes under the categories of most infectious diseases of the world. So, in infants of about 1 years of age, they are especially vaccinated by measles, mumps, and rubella. The most predominant clinical symptoms of it are conjunctivitis, coryza, and complex spots, and as well as a cough. Now, what are complex spots? Complex spots are pinkish spots which arise on the inside of the cheek, and these are diagnostic for measles before the other clinical manifestations of measles, such as cough and severe complications such as pneumonia occur. And it is an increased cause of infant mortality in people, or if in people or infants who have not been vaccinated before. So therefore, it is especially important for us to vaccinate against measles. Measles is also transmitted easily in those people who have a deficiency of vitamin A. So this is underlines why we should always get vaccinated against such preventable diseases such as measles, mumps, rubella, and polio. Thank you. We'll be covering the next topic soon.